In this video, we're going to be looking at the concept of finiteness. So let's consider, first of all, let's think about what the term finite even means kind of generally. So beyond grammar, something is finite if it has an endpoint, it has a limit, it's a fancy word related to finish. That's why you see fin sometimes at the ends of fancy movies. In grammar, then, its core use is going to end up to referring to something that has kind of a natural endpoint, something that has some relationship with time. Okay, as a result, things that will end in the past or present. As a result, our tensed verb forms, our present tense forms, and our preterite verb forms are going to be finite. Other verb forms, like the participial forms in particular, are timeless. They're not hooked in with any particular time. They're going to be non-finite. The plain form is also generally non-finite, but there's two exceptions we'll discuss. And then there's lots of grammatical properties that are tied into finiteness. So let's look at a couple of those. Well, actually, there's about 4 of them. So one thing we see with finite verbs is that they're required for a complete sentence, right? So I hugged him is a complete sentence. We have a preterite tense form in there. Whereas a non-finite form like the ing form, that's not going to give us a complete sentence, right? Hugging him. Now, it might be the natural answer to a question, what are you doing? Hugging him. But hugging him alone is not a complete sentence. Instead, we need to make it part of a larger sentence, like hugging him calmed him down. Hugging him, I discovered that blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there, when we've tied it into part of a larger sentence, they can become finite because now, or we now have a complete sentence because somewhere else in the sentence we have a finite verb, like calmed, which is preterite. Okay. Or I am hugging him, where again, the am, because it's present tense, allows us to have a finite verb, it gives us a finite verb and allows us to have a complete sentence. Another important property with finite verbs is that they generally require an overt subject, so we can't say am hugging him, right? We need that I in there, I am hugging him. Whereas in non-finite verbs, in fact, it's more common than not that they don't have an overt expressed subject. So hugging him calmed him down, there's no subject directly associated with hugging. Who's hugging him? We don't know. Somebody hugging him calmed him down. So there's no subject of hugging. There's no hugger expressed here. When we do have a subject in the subject's required usually in the finite cases, and when we do have one, we get a nominative case. I hugged him, we hugged him, they hugged him, right? So we get these nominative pronouns. When the non-finite verbs, again, more often than not, they don't have a subject with them, but when they do have a subject, that subject does not take a finite verb form. It does not, well, it doesn't take a finite verb form, but it doesn't take a nominative pronoun. So, my hugging him annoyed her, or me hugging him annoyed her. So we get these forms, either the genitive or the accusative. Here, we don't get the nominative, so we couldn't say, I hugging him annoyed her. All right, and then we can also, another property with finite clauses is they can occur after our that subordinator, so she knows that I hugged him. So that marks that this is a subordinate clause inside a larger clause, but it can only mark finite clauses. So she knows that I hugged him. You can't use that with a non-finite subordinate clause. So she began, and then we could have a little subordinate clause hugging him, but we can't include the subordinator that. Okay, so those 4 grammatical properties that are associated with finite verbs and keep them distinct from non-finite verbs. Now the plain form in finiteness, that one's a little complicated. So the plain form is usually non-finite. So for example, in infinitivals, like when you have to before it, to go, to sleep, to see, those have all the hallmarks of being non-finite. So for example, to visit Paris, that's not a complete sentence. You have to say something like, she wants to visit Paris, where we have somewhere in there a finite verb. So to visit Paris, where this verb's in the plain form, that's a fragment. It's not a complete sentence. So the plain form in this use can't give us a complete sentence. Most commonly, we don't have an overt subject, an express subject. So to visit Paris this summer would be delightful. But who's visiting Paris this summer? The sentence doesn't tell us. You assume it's the speaker talking, but the sentence doesn't explicitly state that for you. Okay. When it does have a subject, it's not nominative. So for us to visit Paris would require money, and there's us, and that is the accusative form. You couldn't say for we to visit Paris would require money, right? So we can't use the nominative form there. And we couldn't introduce it by a that subordinator. So we want to visit Paris. Okay, so you have to visit Paris as an embedded non-finite clause. Because it's non-finite, we couldn't introduce it with a subordinator. You can't say we want that to visit Paris. Okay, so most commonly the plain form is non-finite, but there's two exceptions where the plain form occurs in a finite clause. One is in imperatives. So imperatives are sentences like nobody move, or sit down, be quiet, shut up, write your answers in complete sentences. All of those are imperatives. All right, imperatives use the plain form. We can tell here because nobody moves, it doesn't agree, right? So nobody move, there's no agreement there. So we know that's the plain form, not the plain present. And when we use a verb be in the imperative, we use the form be quiet. We use the plain form. We don't say are quiet. As a side note recommendation, it's well worth it to go ahead and memorize your forms of be. There aren't that many of them. So we don't say are quiet, right? All right, but we judge these clauses to be finite for the following reasons. Well, one, they give us a complete sentence, right? Be quiet is a complete sentence. Nobody move is a complete sentence. So we have those as complete sentences. They're headed by the plain form. So there we have to say the plain form is a finite verb. And we can combine it and coordinate it with other finite clauses. So be quiet and I won't hurt you. So we can have a coordination of two clauses, one of which is an imperative and has a plain form, and one of which is a more normal finite clause that has a modal auxiliary in it. Over here, hugging him and I will hurt you, where we have a non-finite form. That doesn't work out, right? Because that's not a complete sentence, and so we can't coordinate it with other complete sentences. So from this evidence, we conclude that imperatives, the plain form in the imperative use is actually finite. Oh, and as it's noted here, it is exceptional since imperatives don't normally have a subject, although it's possible to supply one. So do that again and I'll clock you. You do that again and I'll clock you. Okay, so these are really weird finite sentences, but they are finite sentences, finite clauses. All right, and then the other exceptional use of the finite clause is in the plain form with the subjunctive. So subjunctives are a rare clause type in English. In Spanish, they're fairly common, and verbs have distinct subjunctive inflections. So you can say in Spanish something like, quiero que él cante. Okay, so we have this form here, cante, as opposed to canta. I want him to sing, and that's the subjunctive form. In both Spanish and English, subjunctive clauses are used to express hopes, wishes, demands, things of that nature. But in Spanish, again, the subjunctive is much more robustly used than in English. In English, we don't have a distinctive subjunctive form of the verb. We just use the plain form. So, God bless America, I demanded that he be fired. Okay, so those two underlying verbs there, those are in the plain form. How do we know? Well, because we're not getting any agreement here, right? God bless America, not God blesses America. So that tells us it's the plain form. And of course, when we include a be in the subjunctive clause, it is be as opposed to am or is or are. So why do we think that subjunctives are finite? Well, because when we look at all the properties, they show them all. They can produce a complete sentence. Now, main clause subjunctives are fairly rare, like God bless America, and they're mostly fixed phrases, God bless America, God bless you, things of this nature. But we do have them, and they do give us complete sentences. So God bless America. They require an overt subject. So I demanded that be fired. That's no good. We have to say I demanded that she, or I demanded that Gloria be fired, or I demanded that Fred be fired, something like that. Bless America, that would only be understood as an imperative, right? It's not a otherwise without an overt subject there. When it does take a subject, or as it usually does, that subject appears in the nominative case. I demanded that he be fired. We don't say I demanded that him be fired. And it can be introduced by the subordinator that. I demanded that he be fired. I insisted that she meet my demands. So we have, oops, I should have had that underlined there. So it can be introduced by the that thing, the that subordinator, which says that the clause that it's introducing has to be finite. Okay, so as a result, we conclude that the plain form in imperatives and subjunctives is finite. Everywhere else is going to be non-finite. So let's summarize that. So tensed verbs, such as verbs in the preterite or plain form, are always finite. Participial forms, the gerund participle and the past participle, always non-finite. The plain form is only finite in two cases: when it's in imperatives, like sit down, or in subjunctives, God bless you, he insists that she leave, or he insists she leave. Okay, so in those cases, it's finite. All other uses of the plain form are non-finite. So in two infinitivals, I want to go, that to go is non-finite. In bare infinitivals, I saw him leave. Okay, there we can say there's a subject for who's leaving, him, but again, it's not nominative. I saw him leave. This verb doesn't agree with it. Okay, so that's the plain form. It's a bare infinitival, but you can see it's non-finite, right? Because we don't have an accusative subject here, or we don't have a nominative subject. Same thing up here with I want to go. The to go doesn't have its own subject associated with it. Okay, so again, we know it's non-finite. And with modal auxiliaries, he doesn't live here. Again, live doesn't have its own subject immediately before it. It's non-finite, although we should note the clause as a whole ends up being finite because of doesn't. Doesn't bears tense, right? So as a result, the topmost VP, since it's the head, is third singular present. It's a tense verb phrase. So the clause as a whole is finite, but the finiteness comes from doesn't, not from live. Okay, hopefully with that background, you should be able to tell whether you're dealing with a finite or non-finite verb form.